So let's continue on with our repair of the rudder head. I have the Dutchman constructed and have the epoxy mixed up. And I don't have any clamps that'll fit around the rudder head. So that's why I have the rope wrapped around with the stick. And that's going to create a Spanish windlass which will clamp it. And I'll demonstrate that in a minute. But right now we need to get both surfaces slathered up good with epoxy. That's what I'm doing right now. Okay, now we have to get the Dutchman fitted into place here and get it inside those loops of rope. And okay, so now I got it fitted in. So then I'm going to twist the stick, and both ends of the rope are tied to the stick. So as I twist it, it's going to cinch the whole thing up and act like a giant clamp. And so I got it all tightened up. So then I just have to belay it somewhere. We'll just use the step on the rudder, and we'll let that set up overnight. So back the next day, and the Dutchman is glued in place, and now we just have to fair it. So again, I'm going to start off with my crosscut saw, and I'm being careful to keep the saw blade parallel to the side of the rudder head, because I want those cuts to be parallel to the rudder head, so that when I chisel the wood away, the Dutchman will also be parallel and therefore flush with the rudder head. So we got the saw cuts in. Now we're going to go at it with a chisel and a hammer to give a little gentle tap tap. And notice how quickly the wastage, as they say, the wood just chips right off with a good sharp chisel. It's a very efficient way to do things, which is of course why a chisel is a very basic carpenter's tool. Now that we got it chiseled away, we're going to go at it again with the bevel plane, just to get that last, almost the last step. We'll use the bevel plane to get it flush, and then of course finally we'll sand the whole thing down and varnish. And we're getting it pretty good here. The next clip here, we'll see that's looking like it belongs to the rudder head. And so then we just have the other edge to do. And then I'm going to apply some West epoxy with the 407 filler, which is conveniently wood colored. And that'll fill the remaining gaps. So when we get it all sanded down, that's definitely beginning to take shape. While we can see that that piece of teak definitely did not come from the same tree as the rest of the rudder head, throw on some varnish and it'll look fine. So it's time to put the first coat of varnish on the mast. And I'm going to thin this first coat about 50-50. So it's going to be half varnish and half turpentine. That's because you want to get that first coat to soak deep into the wood. That'll give you much better adhesion, and also will seal it off from the weather better once you build more coats up. So no magic here. I'm going to apply the varnish with a 2-inch Badger varnish brush. And for now I'm just going to do it a half at a time. So I'll do the top half, as I'm doing now. And then I'm going to roll the mast over. Being, of course, very careful not to roll it off the sawhorses. That's always a potential disaster. So just pay attention to what you're doing. And then we'll varnish the other half. And so, nearly 2 weeks later, we got 12 coats of varnish on the mast and 4 coats of Hatteras Off-White bright side polyurethane on the top, where the spreaders are. And with that, we're ready to start putting the rigging back on. So one of the problems I've been having is the bronze tangs where the rigging attaches. Is that in places the shackles and the clevis pins are beginning to wear through, so the round holes are becoming ovals. And so a solution I've come up with is to use some cheap copper tubing. And in this case, we're working on the tang to the jib stay, which is not always tight, because a running backstays, the jib stay is not always pulled tight. So it wiggles around a bit, and the clevis pin is wearing through that tang. So what I'm constructing here is a half round of copper, which I've made out of that copper tubing, which I'm going to insert in the lower half of the tang. And it'll essentially act as a sacrificial sleeve. And what I find is, because the copper's soft, the pressure of the clevis pin against it will just kind of squish it up against the bronze. So the copper will not move. And so the clevis pin will then chafe against the copper, not against the bronze. And every few years or so, I can just replace the copper. Granted, that sometimes means doing it from a bosun's chair, but it's still doable. So we've got the clevis. I'm just banging the clevis pin in there. It's fairly snug because of that half round of copper tubing. And then, but we got it through. I'm just going to put the cotter pin in now. And I'll show a close-up of this in a minute so you can see it. So just putting the cotter pin in at the end of the clevis and splaying the cotter pin, so the cotter pin doesn't come out, so the clevis pin doesn't come out. And here you can see the half round at the bottom of the clevis pin, and notice that the copper doesn't move as the clevis pin moves. And so that'll, and with tension, as I said, that'll just kind of squish up against the tang and hold the copper in place. So now we're going to work on the tang for the peak halyard, and this will take the shackle to the block to the peak halyard. And notice I have some of that half-inch copper sleeve right over the pin to the shackle. And I also have a piece of half-round copper, just as before, in the bottom of the tang. So now I'm going to try to assemble all that. So we got to get the copper sleeve in. Put the copper sleeve in first, then the shackle pin. And tighten up the shackle pin. So unfortunately I didn't do a close-up of this one. But if you look closely, you can see the half round on the bottom of the tang and the copper sleeve over the shackle pin. So both the peak and the throat halyards of the mainsail need to be replaced this year. And I'm going to use a low stretch braided line. I never learned how to splice braided line, whether cord or uncord. It just looked awfully complicated to me. So the way I'm going to attach the standing end to the beckets on the blocks is to use seizings. And an excellent reference source for doing this sort of thing is the Complete Rigger's Apprentice by Brian Toss. And I'll put the reference at the end of the video. But the way I'm going to start out is I'm going to sew through. I'm putting the first seizing in. And I'm going to sew through both lines. And I'm going to pass the needle 4 or 5 times through. And so just sew the 2 lines together. And then I'm going to wrap the twine, nice tight wrapping there, over the same place where I just sewed. And then the final thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a couple of wraps with the twine over the seizing right between the 2 lines. And that's what I'm doing right now. And then there's a little fancy knot you'll tie at the end to secure the end of the twine. And then finally, usually just dive the needle through the rope a couple of times with the twine, just to make sure it doesn't come loose. So here's what our first seizing looks like. Now the second seizing I'm going to put on there is a little different. I'm going to put a racking seizing. And it's similar to the first one. I'm going to start by just sewing the needle, passing the needle just back and forth through the line once. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take wraps, but in a figure-8 pattern. So I'm wrapping around both lines, and then it's crossing in the center between the 2 lines. So it's forming figure-8s. And again, I'll refer you to Brian Toss's book on how to do this. And then I'm going to put a third seizing a bit further back there, and that'll be the same as the first seizing. And as I've said, I've never had 3 seizings come out or even start to come undone. And so here's what it looks like with all 3 seizings in. Okay, so we've got all the rigging back on, and the last thing we need to do here is what I call mousing the shackle pins. And what we're going to do is, you see, I'm going to pass a heavy stainless steel wire, 19 gauge stainless steel wire, through the hole at the end of the pin, and then loop it through the shackle. And I'm going to do that twice. So I'm going to have 2 turns all the way through. Pull it tight, and then twist the ends of the wire. And for the very end of that, to get it nice and tight, I'll use my needle nose pliers. And then trim off the excess wire. I'll tighten it a little more first. And we'll trim off the end of the wire. If your cutter's dull, you can always just bend the wire back and forth. It'll break. And then the last thing I want to do is take my needle nose pliers and just turn that inward there, so you don't have a sharp edge exposed that can catch things or give you a nasty cut when working aloft. So, with all that done, the mast is all ready to go back up. The rudder had developed a mysterious grousing of late, which I don't like. I don't like mysterious noises. So I'm going to see if I can find out what's going on. This is an outboard rudder, so it can simply be lifted off the pinions and set down. However, the rudder is quite heavy, and it's a job that requires 4 men, particularly because it's at an awkward angle. So what I'm going to do is just use the tiller as a lever and just pick the rudder up about an inch or so using the tiller, and then I have some boards stuck underneath there with a makeshift fulcrum there. And as you can see, it picked the rudder up about an inch or so. You'll see it in a minute here. So as you can see, the rudder's up off the gudgeon a bit, and so I just moved the washer out of the way and scraping off some of the buildup there, and just having a good look at those pintles and inside the gudgeons to see if I can see anything that's amiss. And that's the top set of pintles and gudgeons. They're just 2, and I'll do the same one for the set at the bottom of the rudder. And while I'm at it, I'm going to put some grease in there, both around the top of the pintle, and also I'll reach up underneath into the gudgeon there and put a little heavy-duty marine grease. And that itself might cure the grousing, though I'm still not exactly sure where the noise is coming from. And so I'm back up on the boat now, and I'm just going to gently lower the rudder back down onto its gudgeon there. And with that grease, it certainly feels nice, and it swings just like a pendulum. So as far as I can tell, everything is okay with the rudder. And finally, we have the tiller, and more wear and tear. You can see that hole there. That's where the bolt goes through at the rudder head, and the tiller pivots on that bolt. And as you can see, that hole was round, and it's now been turned into an oval. And where that's a problem is the fact that the tiller is getting lower and lower, so it's now beginning to scrape against the cross piece I have for the sculling oar. And if it goes any lower, it'll also scrape against the top of the combing. So I'm going to try to repair that now. So after cleaning the hole out with some sandpaper, as you can see, I'm laying down tape, and I'm going to lay down some tape on either side. And it's going to cover just a little more than half of the now oval-shaped hole. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to squirt some epoxy in there and fill it up to the top of the tape. So I'll use the little syringe tool there. Just inject some epoxy and just let it settle and fill. So after giving that an overnight dry, then we're going to use our drill to drill out the hole. And we're going to have to drill from both ends there. And let's get the bolt and see how we did. So that's definitely much more snug. And so we've just filled up the worn part of that hole with epoxy. So hopefully that'll cure our problem.